actually let me, oh, thank you. And then we also have closed captioning available. And if there are any issues, any tech issues, please feel free to message me or Mark directly. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is today's agenda. It looks quite short. However, there is a lot of things in each of these points. We'll do quick introductions, and then we'll introduce H3 and home base. And then we will discuss what is HUD CoC funding. And we will then talk about how do you all apply for funding and what can you all use funding for. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the next steps are. Thank you. All right, so as I said, I'm Alex and I'm with Home Base. I'm gonna allow my colleague Mark to introduce himself.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Good morning. My name is Mark Mora. I work with Alex at Home Base. And I think Jamie Schechter is not here yet, if I'm not mistaken. But let's have H3 folks, whoever's on, if you can introduce yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, sorry.
No, go, Mary.
Coordinated and Mary Juarez Fitzgerald, coordinated entry here with H3.
Hi, everyone. Shelby Ferguson, CoC administrator with H3. I think Jamie J is here.
Yep, I'm Jamie Jeanette. I'm the community engagement specialist for Health, Housing, and Homeless Services.
Good morning, folks. Jose, the Permanent Supportive Housing Program Coordinator.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. And I just want to point out that this email here is, if you during this whole NOFO process, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to email us here. And I think we will show this email at the end of the session as well. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so before we dive into the nitty-gritty details of NOFO and the NOFO process, we want to take a pulse and see who's all in the room here with us today. But maybe some of you have already used this platform before, but in order to get into this platform, you'll have to you can scan the QR code with your phone, which is pretty easy. It should automatically just pop up. And then, or you can also go in your browser and type in www.menti.com and it'll ask you for the code. So if you put that code in, that should take you directly there. Oh, thanks, Mark, for putting that in the chat. And so what we'll do is we'll go through a couple of questions here, as I said, just to get to know each other a little bit, and then we'll get started and go into all the details of NOFO. And let us know if folks are having any issues with getting into Mentimeter. I see some folks have already started to answer the questions. All right. So first one, has your agency applied for CoC NOFO funding? It looks like a lot of yeses, a couple no's. We have 22 people on, so I'm going to give it a second for folks to get a chance to respond. So that the yeses keep increasing. Great. Awesome. I'm seeing Jamie Jeanette's comment. I love seeing the no's because it means there are new providers here. True. Love to see it. And hopefully this will be informative for you all. All right. Should we go to the next one? Thanks, Mark. So next question. How familiar are you with the CoC NOFO competition process? I'm a blank state. I know a few things. I'm experienced. I could lead this training. I love it. All right. Looks like it's a mixed group. All right. So the next question is, where do you spend the most time in Contra Costa County? In the east, the south, central? Looks like some folks in the west, a couple in the central area, east. All right. All right. Thank you. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Thanks, Mark. So the second, or not the second one, the next one is, what is your race and or ethnicity? Submit as many answers as you would like. Here we go. All right. Some diversity here. Oh, thanks, Mark. The next question is, do you have current or past experience of homelessness? Oh, I should have mentioned too, sorry, this is a little bit late into the activity. If you want to answer anything on the chat, that's also totally okay. Sorry, I should have said that earlier. Okay, it looks like some diversity in this respect as well. Okay, and then what questions do you all have about the CoC funding process? We hope that we, the session answers some of these, but we will go through them and see if we'll cover them today. And if not, please feel free to, if we don't cover any of your questions that you have now, feel free to email us at that email that I showed you earlier, and we'll show it again, and we can get back to you. Okay, when will the process start? Well, the process has kind of already been underway, but the deadlines and things like that will be hopefully released soon, but we don't really know because HUD doesn't really announce it until they announce it. Let's see. Okay, Blake, stay, any information is great. What are the processes for cash advancements on an award, availability of funds for organizations not previously in continuum? Okay. Okay, these are all great things, and we'll keep these in mind as we go through today and moving forward. Anything else? How much time will we have to complete and submit the application? That kind of depends on when the NOFO is released. And we will talk a little bit more about this during our TA workshop, which hasn't been announced yet, but that will happen after the NOFO is released. How do you pick the review and rank board? We won't get into all of the details of that, but we will talk a little bit about that today too. Mostly the review and rank, I think, will be discussed during the TA workshop. Anything else? All right. So let's get started. What is HUD CoC program funding? Next slide, please. Before we talk about what that is, let's we figured we should talk about some of these acronyms. Some of you may already be familiar with them, but in case you're not, the national players are HUD, one of them, which the big one. It is HUD stands for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They are a federal government agency that releases the money, and they get to set the program rules. They are essentially the funder, and so they make the rules and they provide the funding. We will refer to HUD a lot today, so just keep that in mind. And then we have CoC, which stands for Continuum of Care. It is important to note that when we talk about CoC, there's different ways that we use the term. So one of them is the streaming fund. So the CoC HUD funding, but also we use the term more broadly, which can refer to a group of community stakeholders that are generally, across the country. There's different CoC communities or community CoCs. And in this case, we're talking about Contra Costa. And basically a CoC is, like I said, a bunch of folks working together to address and end homelessness in their communities. But we do use the term interchangeably, so just be aware of that. And then, of course, we have NOFO, as we mentioned earlier, which stands for Notice of Funding Opportunity. And one thing that's important to say too is that NOFO can also be used as a term to refer to other funding, but in this case, we are specifically referring to HUD CoC NOFO funding. Thanks, Mark. Okay, and now in terms of local players, we have Homebase, as I introduced us a little bit earlier, and for Homebase right now in this meeting, it's myself and Mark, but we do have other folks, other colleagues that work with H3. And so our role here with the NOFO is that we're neutral facilitators to the NOFO competition process. And you'll see a lot of communications coming from us moving forward. And as I mentioned before, if any questions about the NOFO process come up, please do feel free to reach out to us directly. And then one thing is, I mentioned it earlier, and I think I'll mention it throughout this presentation, but we will be scheduling a TA workshop later on to go into the nitty-gritty details of what the actual application and the application process will entail. So keep an eye out for those emails, and that will be after the NOFO is released. All right, and then we also have the collaborative applicant. The collaborative applicant in the context of CoC NOFO is the entity that is designated by the CoC to collect and to submit the collaborative application. We will discuss the collaborative application a little bit later, but it is essentially a big application package that is going to be submitted to HUD to apply for the funding. And so in Contra Costa County, the collaborative applicant is H3, Contra Costa Housing, Health, and Homeless Services. And then we have the providers, which we also use the terms applicants or project applicants. And they are the list that you see here. That is a list of renewal project applicants from Contra Costa CoC. They are projects that received funding in the previous year in 2022. And you'll see at the bottom where it says new project applicants. So any new project or new agency that's applying for funding this year, they're also considered providers and applicants and project applicants. Thanks, Mark. Next one. All right. So the CoC program funding. The first thing to know is that it is a federal funding stream and it is administered by HUD. It is the CoC program grants come with many standards and many requirements. We will cover a little bit later, but these restrictions, there's some restrictions on how the funding can be used. And also any requirements for an internal grant and financial management capacity and data collection and reporting requirements, all kinds of things we will discuss a little bit later. It is also, this funding is typically awarded in 1-year grants. So if an agency applies for a new grant in 2023, they'll request the funding needed to operate that grant for a period of 1 year. And the third thing, as I mentioned before, it is an annual competition. So that means that when an agency receives a CoC program grant, if the agency wants to continue to receive that funding, they have to reapply. So for any projects that received funding last year, this year they would be considered renewal projects, and they will be reapplying to extend the funding for 1 more year. And let's see. And of course, this is all it's federal funding to end homelessness. Like that is the goal of this CoC funding program. All right, are there any questions so far? You feel free to unmute yourselves or raise your hand, put it in the chat. I'm not seeing any.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Maybe I missed it. I'm sorry. This is Joe Serrano. Question is, what type of projects are eligible to be funded?
I believe we covered this a little bit later. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, we're definitely going to cover this. That's a great question, Joe. Yeah, we'll cover this in my section actually after Alex is done. So yeah, we'll get there. So you can sit tight.
The reason I'm actually asking is because if I don't need to be in the meeting, then I can unplug. I'm a CDC here in Contra Costa County, primarily doing housing. We have a tiny house, a building academy. That's the only thing I could see that's related to the work or to this program. And if there's funding available for projects or programs such as a tiny house building academy, then I would be interested in hearing more. But if not, it's the only type of homeless type program that we operate in terms of how it relates to homelessness. And the primary purpose of the tiny houses that we're building is for people who are actually unsheltered, but they work and they live in their cars. So we're trying to provide a homeownership opportunity for them through the tiny homes that we're building.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, generally speaking, again, we'll go over this a little later if you're able to hang out for a little bit. But generally speaking, the CoC NOFO funding, they fund particular project types, so permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and then joint transitional housing, rapid rehousing. So generally speaking, those are the program types that it funds.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Joe. Anybody else? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so this is, we wanted to show you like an overall flow of what the process looks like. So HUD releases the NOFO. I think last year I wasn't here for it when I was released. I think it was in August. This year we're hoping that it's earlier, but we don't know, as we mentioned earlier. But once it is released, then each CoC, including Contra Costa, will submit a consolidated application to HUD, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like a little bit later. And then once this application is sent to HUD, HUD makes a determination on who and how much to award grants directly. And it's important to note that the grants do go directly to individual agency applicants, and the CoC is not like a pass-through for those funds. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of like a bird's eye view of how the CoC funding is distributed to CoCs. We see HUD right at the very top, and then we have Contra Costa County CoC. We also have other COCs within the Bay Area. We have Alameda, and then we have San Mateo. And then you'll see under each COC, we have Project 1, Project 2, and then possibly you. So meaning that it goes, these projects are under the applying COC. And so you could potentially be on this list. All right, and I should mention, maybe this is in the next slide, actually. Yeah, go ahead, Mark. So as I said, we don't know how much funding is available yet because the NOFO hasn't been released, but we do know that last year, 2022, Contra Costa received 17.3 million. As I said, it hasn't been released yet, but something just to keep in mind is that there are over 450 COCs nationwide that are basically HUD is distributing the money in between those COCs who submit the applications and become eligible. All right, next slide. Excuse me. So this, just for your reference, this is a list of all of the projects that were awarded that received funding last year that incorporated the 17.3 million. The red are the permanent supportive housing projects. The orange / kind of like mustard yellow is rapid rehousing. So you'll see there's 2. And then the teal are system support. And as I said, so Contra Costa as a COC, the total funding they received was 17.3 million. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so how do I apply for funding? Such a great question, and probably what you're all waiting for, right? So before we talk about the logistics of applying, we wanted to provide some clarity around the renewal projects and new projects. I touched a little bit on these earlier, but a renewal project are projects that received funding a previous year, so 2022, and they want to continue to receive funding in this new year, 2023. So they'll have to apply this year to continue that funding. Any new projects are projects that don't currently receive funding, either because the project is a totally new project and they don't exist yet and they're hoping to exist. And also, or if they perhaps are an existing project, but this is the first time that they're seeking COC funding. And so it's important to note that if it's an existing project that did not receive funding from COC before, the COC funding cannot supplant or replace funding that they were receiving from a different source. However, if your project received a one-time fund to get started, for example, like Project Homekey, and it needs to secure additional funding to, for it to continue its operations, then that could be a potential new project for COC funds, eligible for COC funds. So just want to put that out there. Next slide, please. Or anybody have any questions before I move on? I'm looking at the chat, okay. Cool, thank you. All right, so now let's talk about the selection process. So we like to think of it as a 2-part selection process. And it is, the part 1 is the local competition. And then part 2 is the national competition. So when we say local competition, that means in this case, it's Contra Costa County. And there is a local process that has been created that allows for projects and agencies to apply for this funding. And so agencies, both renewal and new, will submit a local application. Once they're submitted, the local applications are going to be reviewed and ranked by a local review and rank panel that scores those applications. And based on the scores, all of the applications are ranked, and then with it develop a priority listing. The priority listing is super important because it gives the order of preference of projects to be funded. And there's a higher likelihood that projects that are higher on the priority list, because they scored higher, will get funding than projects that are lower on the priority listing because they received a lower score. So we won't get much into detail about how the scoring process works, but we will, as I said before, we will touch base on that during the TA workshop, which will happen after the NOFO drops. But basically, the higher a project scores, the better the chances are, or the likelihood is, for the projects to be funded, or for the projects to be funded. So basically, bottom line, priority listing is super important. Okay, and then we have part 2, which is the national competition. The CoC submits the collaborative application to HUD, and there's a couple of different pieces to that. I'll review it a little bit later. And then HUD decides what to fund. It basically compares all the CoC collaborative applications across the country, and as I mentioned earlier, and it has its own determination and formula to decide who to fund. But they also really look at the priority listing. So the priority listing is also really, really important. It's a really important part of the selection process and the application process in general. Okay, next slide. So with the two-section process, we also have a 2-part application. The first part is the local application. And so the local application, it has some longer answer questions, some short answers, and some attachments that you'll be required to submit. The application will ask for some details, including what kind of funding you want, how you plan to spend the funding, the number of people, individuals that will be served. They'll also ask for a detailed budget and the site addresses for the projects, etc., things like that. And again, these answers will be used to evaluate, to score, and to rank each project application. So note that there is a scoring tool for both renewal projects, well, one for renewal projects and one for new projects that are used to score each application. And so these scoring tools have been developed at the local level, so here in Contra Costa County, and they are revised and improved every year. And some folks that are on this call may have already been a part of the process. And that process does happen in the funding committee. Just a little plug. So if you're interested in being a part of that process of revising the scoring tools, make sure to join the funding committee. Okay, next slide, please. All right, just take a quick look. Okay, perfect. Let's see. Well, wait, Mark, I think we skipped one. Yes, thank you. Okay, so then the second part of the application is the HUD project application. So any projects that want to apply to complete or must complete a project application and submit that to HUD, that is done through HUD's eSNAP system. And we'll talk a lot more about what eSNAPs looks like and what is entailed during the TA workshop. But this is a formal request for funding, essentially. Like the local application, they will also ask for longer answers, or they'll have questions that require longer answers, short answers, and attachments as well. But I will say, HB we will be here providing TA. So for any questions that you might have, or we can help troubleshoot anything and ensure that you all are in compliance with HUD rules. So don't worry, we will be here for support during the application process. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is again another visual to show you kind of the flow. So each spring, the community discusses and revises the scoring criteria. As I mentioned earlier, we have a renewal project scoring tool, we have a new project scoring tool, and we also have a written CoC application process. And as I mentioned, these are all revised within the funding committee, which is a committee of the Council of Homelessness. And so after the NOFO is released, the review and ring panel will convene and they will apply the scoring criteria using both the renewal and the new, respective to whatever kind of project it is. And they will, at the end, will produce, after scoring all of the applications, they'll produce the priority listing, which will also then be submitted. And actually that brings us, to the next slide, which is, this is the collaborative application, right? So the one large thing, as I mentioned earlier. But let's see. Can you, Mark? Yeah, we just do all of them. Thank you. Okay, so instead of having, so the collaborative application is instead of having individual organizations or providers apply directly to HUD, HUD instead requires that each community COC they require each COC to submit a single application packet. So that's the collaborative application, right? That's what we call it. And so the collaborative application is made up of these three things. And so the first one are the project applications. These are the individual applicants, agencies that will be submitting a project application to HUD. This is only a part of the whole collaborative application. And then and that's in the teal here. And then there's also the CoC application. And this application is about like the general CoC body, the structure, its members, and is a part of how HUD determines whether this collaborative application is a good one, if it has, what its strengths are. And again, the CoC application is something that the collaborative applicant, which in this case in Contra Costa County is H3. And so let's see. So yeah, so as an individual who's applying for an individual project, you don't have to worry about the CoC application. What you do is the project applications. And then the last part of it, it can't be said enough, the priority listing, which is super important. Again, it goes through the scoring process with the review and rank. Once the review and rank finalizes scoring all of them, they will be put into this priority listing. And that also is a part of the collaborative application. And so all of this collaborative application has to be submitted, and there will be a deadline, but we don't have that deadline yet. NOFO hasn't been released, and the deadline is not available for us yet. All right, does anybody have any questions about any of the things that I've covered so far? Oh, I'm looking at the chat now. Thanks, Jamie, for putting those in there. And yes, they've been approved and they're ready to go. All right, I don't see any questions. And I'm gonna pass it over to Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alex. Hi again, everyone. Definitely want to encourage y'all, if you have questions, we're going to pause every so often, but feel free to put it in the chat. You can also raise your hand. We don't mind being interrupted, but sometimes we also might not be able to answer the question right then and there, especially if the answer to the question is coming up in a future slide, we might say that. But before I cover this slide, I just want to take a moment. I know Jamie Schechter is in the room now. Jamie, do you want to introduce yourself? We had the rest of H3 staff introduce themselves earlier.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Apologies. I was in another meeting that was a conflict, so I was a little late. But my name is Jamie Schechter. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a homeless services chief here with H3. My team includes the CoC team and the coordinated entry team, and we work really closely with home base throughout the entire NOFO process.
Thanks, Jamie. Glad to have you here. All right, so we'll keep moving. Just want to cover this slide. I'm not going to spend too much time on these items, but certainly you can ask a question. Just wanted to give you all a heads up. If you are thinking about submitting an application, amidst or in addition to some other tips we'll give you later in the presentation, here's some other things that you can get in motion sooner than later. Again, if you're going to apply, you'll need to do these things at some point. So one of them is you need to be an eligible applicant. And so you need to be a nonprofit or a local government agency. And there are a couple other kind of subcategories within there. So you can be state, local government, instrumentality of state or local government, public housing agency, tribal entity. All of those categories means that you at least are eligible to apply. And obviously there's a whole lot of other boxes you have to check. It's also important to know if you are a nonprofit or you're considering or you're in the process of being a nonprofit, you do have to have your 501c3 status. documents in place before you officially apply. So we've had some folks in the past who have been kind of in process to get that. And so just want to let you know that if that's something that you haven't finalized yet, you'll need to have that in place before you apply. Also, you'll need an active sam.gov registration. SAM stands for System for Award Management. It's something the federal government uses to do business with them. It's free, but you have to sign up and you have to, I think, submit a couple documents to register all of those things. They also do something new called or relatively new, they changed it in 2022. They use something called the Unique Identity Identifier, UEI. They no longer use what's called the DUNS number, which was a third party. So you'll need one of these, and you should be able to get one of those when you register with SAM. So that'll be an option for you to get one of those numbers, which you'll need to use in your actual project application to HUD. So you need that as well. You also need to have an applicant profile for your organization in eSnaps. We're not going to go over eSnaps today, but if you do end up applying, we're going to give you all the information you need in order to create an applicant profile. It's part of your project application to HUD. You'll also need to have a compliant code of conduct. This is a HUD requirement. It means you're basically conducting business in accordance with ethical standards, things like, solicitation, acceptance of gifts, those are things you're not going to do, or people in your organization or board. And there's, in this code of conduct, there's disciplinary actions for these types of things. But most organizations, if not all, should have something of this nature already adopted. So it shouldn't be a heavy lift for an organization to do this, but just know that it's something you have to do. You're supposed to email it to HUD and it gets added to an electronic library of policies. So you need to have that in place before you apply. Also, you need to get documentation of match commitments. This is something, again, this is on the slide before you submit an application. If you don't already have this in place, important to get that in motion. HUD, the CoC program requires a 25% match of the awarded grant amount minus funds for leasing. And so this can be satisfied by cash or in kind. And you'll need letters to document this commitment, and it's in a certain format. So that's information that you'll get again at the TA workshop, to technical assistance workshop, if you're going to move forward with the process, because that is mandatory for applicants to attend the TA workshop that hasn't been scheduled yet. So yeah, just some things to pay attention to if you're going to submit an application. I see Joe putting a plug there. Hi, Joe. Great to have you here. Yeah, I actually have a slide later that talks about partnerships. So thank you, Joe, who's looking for organizations potentially to partner with. I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. So we're moving on to the question of what can I use the funding for? I know some folks were asking questions about this. So we'll have a couple slides that go over kind of what you can use the money for, including the project types, which is not this slide, but we want to cover this slide first. And I'm going to actually go into detail with a number of these things. So I'm just going to touch on them briefly here. The HUD CoC NOFO funding is meant to serve those who meet HUD's definition of homelessness. I'm going to talk about that in a couple slides, but just want to say that up front. Folks commonly ask this. You can specialize in serving a subpopulation, certain restrictions and limits, specifically around fair housing. We'll talk about that a little later as well. Also a plug for the CoC ESG written standards for Contra Costa CoC, which recently updated that document, which has a lot of information about this as well. You provide housing through master leasing or rental assistance. I'll talk about master leasing a little bit later, but basically master leasing is a type of lease that gives the leasee the right to control and sublease the property during the lease while the owner retains the legal title. It says there, or rental assistance, or you can provide all or some rental assistance for your clients. So that's something that this money is meant to do. You as an agency provider can also pay for staff, of course, because if you're going to provide critical services, housing, you need people to run that program. And so yes, you can pay for staff, case managers, supervisors. You also can get administrative overhead funds to a certain percentage with this funding. So all of that can be covered. And of course, if you're going to cover those things, it has to be connected to, right, the services that the housing program that you are putting together to serve people. So, you know, the things have to match and correspond to one another. You're also can pay for services along housing, in fact, alongside housing. In fact, that's an important component of this funding. It's not just housing, it's also meant to have services alongside housing. And we'll talk about the project types in a little bit. So in general, here are some things that this funding can do, that you can pay for. What can't you do with this funding? This funding, though all of these things listed are very important, these things cannot be, the funding cannot be used for these things. So emergency shelter, you cannot use CoC NOFO funding for emergency shelter. There are other funding sources you can get to fund that, but not this funding source. You cannot have supportive services without the housing, except for coordinated entry, which you can't apply for because H3 staffs coordinated entry. So yeah, so you cannot fund supportive services separate from providing housing in your project. It doesn't fund new transitional housing unless that transitional housing is combined with rapid rehousing. So it would be a joint program. And it does not fund homelessness prevention. So those are the things that it does not fund. So hopefully that clears it up for some folks if you had questions about that. But what can it fund? So I talked about this earlier because I think it was Joe that asked the question. So it can fund permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is a long-term housing subsidy and case management. The client has a lease. This is, you know, meant, again, the word permanent's in there for someone to be there for very long term. And so that's one project type. We call this PSH, permanent supportive housing. Another project type is rapid rehousing. It's time limited housing subsidy, also with case management and services. Client has a lease as well under this project type. So again, those are two of, you know, in this CoC, most of the projects fall under that have been funded already are PSH or rapid rehousing projects. Again, I talked earlier about how transitional housing cannot be funded, at least not available on its own. And transitional housing is time limited housing and case management and services. The client has temporary housing, so they don't have a lease on that house. But again, you can do transitional housing if it's combined with rapid rehousing. So you could have a combined transitional housing, rapid rehousing project. So those are the acceptable project types to be funded with CoC NOFO funds. And I kind of touched on this already, but all of those housing projects, right, that fall under those categories, you have to offer housing assistance, either a subsidy or actual physical unit, or you're providing the physical unit for somebody. You're providing case management, so a person or a team to help the client identify their needs, goals, connect them with resources, coach them through the process. And then other services as well. You're trying to meet the needs of, you know, folks who are unhoused, to make sure that they not only are in housing but have the means to sustainably stay in housing. And so there's a myriad of different services you can provide. I'm sure many of you work for organizations who do all or some parts of these things: medical, behavioral health care, employment training, transportation, life skills, credit repair, food, clothing, those kinds of things. So it's housing plus case management plus supportive services. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but like I said, master leasing, you can sign a lease on an apartment all in one building or scattered around the city, and HUD reimburses you for the cost of the lease. Clients can sign subleases of at least 12 months with you. Rental assistance means you help clients find third-party landlords and clients sign leases directly with them for at least 12 months. And you give clients a monthly stipend, perhaps to help with rent. And there are pros and cons to each. I'm not going to go over all of them, but again, we'll send a slide deck if this is useful to you as you consider which option to go with in terms of providing housing assistance. And just important to note, you can also cover other costs that are related to housing: security deposits, one-time utility deposits, minor property damage, property management costs. Those are all things that are allowable under this grant funding. So back to definitions of HUD's definition of homelessness. And so defining homelessness, there are multiple categories. I'm not going to go into them into detail because, I mean, you really could spend a whole training talking about HUD's definition of homelessness. And so I am going to link you to a file in the chat. So there are 4 categories of homelessness: is literal homelessness, imminent risk of homelessness, homeless under other federal statutes, and fleeing and attempting to flee domestic violence. And then there's even a 3-part definition of what is considered chronically homeless. And so what's important to note, just that HUD has a specific definition of what it considers to be in a situation of homelessness. So this CoC NOFO funding is meant to serve folks in those that meet those criteria or definitions. So if you don't know what that definition is, we're pointing you to that definition. Definitely something to look at if you're not familiar with it. But again, if you have an agency or program that currently or intends to serve people who may not fit within this definition, you can serve them with other funding sources. But again, this funding source, CoC NOFO, is meant to serve people who meet this criteria, and there's a whole set of like documentation and eligibility determination that you'll need to learn if you're not familiar with it, that we won't spend time talking about it here, but those are things that you need to look into for sure if you're gonna apply for a project with CoC NOFO funding. So I'm gonna keep moving. Can I specialize in a subpopulation? That's a common question. So can you focus with your project on just a particular demographic of people in your community? The answer is yes. Generally speaking, you can serve a particular homeless subpopulation if the housing, 1, addresses a need identified by the CoC for the geographic area, so Contra Costa County. So if it meets a particular need, yes, and it meets one of several criteria. And I'm not going to go through all the criteria here, but one of them, and an important one, is you cannot discriminate against federally protected classes. So race, color, national origin, religion, disability. And here's some examples of common special populations that folks serve. So youth is one. Another is families with children, survivors of domestic violence, veterans, people with disabling conditions. So you just have to be aware of fair housing and anti-discrimination laws. And yeah, you need to make sure that you're familiar with those laws and that you can't, and that you don't, again, discriminate against a federally protected class, but you can serve particular subpopulations. Any questions? I have too many windows open.
I see one question in the chat. Jerry's asking about seniors as a subpopulation. And I believe the answer to that is yes.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is yes. You can serve seniors. But again, the other thing I didn't mention here is if you run out of people or can't recruit people to within your specialized population, then you need to serve the general unhoused population. So yes, you can serve seniors. You can serve any of the populations that are listed, and there's a couple other ones you can serve as well. Thanks, John. Appreciate the example. Yeah, Kathy, to your question, yes. You can specialize in focusing on victims of human trafficking, some of which there's some overlap potentially with survivors of domestic violence, though also differences. Any other questions? Okay. So I talked about this earlier. I know Joe was typing in the chat earlier about wanting to partner with folks. Can I partner with other agencies? You absolutely can. Partnerships between agencies can increase capacity and impact and also leverage resources. In fact, HUD encourages that folks partner with housing, health, and service agencies, so community-based orgs, public and private healthcare agencies, all the types of organizations listed there. For housing organizations, HUD actually gives the CoC extra points in the CoC app if they have projects that intend to partner with public housing agencies, state and local housing orgs to develop housing units, provide housing subsidies, and leverage targeted voucher programs and other housing resources. For healthcare and public health agencies, HUD incentivizes this as well for the CoC, partner with public and private healthcare orgs to assist program participants in obtaining medical insurance and overall just improving health outcomes for your clients. These are things that HUD encourages and knows that is necessary to have a broad set of stakeholders working together to end homelessness in a community. Something to note, Joe, does that include behavioral health? Yes, it can. Absolutely, it can. There must be a lead agency for the application that is an eligible applicant. So I talked earlier about the different types of organizations that are eligible: nonprofit, local government agency, tribe or tribal entity. There has to be a lead agency that is an eligible applicant. And then other agencies can partner with that lead agency and essentially apply together, but the fiscal agent is going to be the lead agency for that, for the funding. And it's important that if you want to do this, you want to partner with folks, you need to start these conversations early. The CoC NOFO has not dropped yet. We don't know what's going to be released, but it doesn't hurt to have those conversations now, start to meet people, start to brainstorm what resources you all can bring to the table. And to help with that, I'm going to try this. We haven't done this in years past, but I want to see if maybe this can help facilitate some of these conversations. So I'm going to screen share back to Mentimeter, and hopefully you have it open still. If not, no worries, you can open it up again. But we're going to just take a minute or two to do this. If you're interested in partnering for the CoC NOFO, please type your name, email, agency, what you're looking for, any details you want really in here, but specific or namely like your contact information in your organization. Again, if you haven't used Mentimeter, you go to menti.com and then type in that code 63707988. You could also take your phone and scan that QR code and you could access it on your phone. But just wanted to provide some space for folks to just say, hey, I'm looking for someone to partner with. If you're comfortable sharing your contact information here, and what we'll do is we'll actually send this to all of the folks that registered for this workshop. So anybody interested in partnering with other agencies? Thanks, Joe. Indicated that there's some interest to partner. Thanks for putting your info in the chat. We'll also send the save chat file to everyone as well. But if folks aren't comfortable, or maybe it's an indication that maybe no one's looking to partner really, apart from a couple. But maybe we can have a conversation with H3 to see how other ways perhaps that we can foster these connections and conversations. Again, the earlier the better to start making these connections.
Mark, June asked in the chat, can an agency that has all the qualifications partner with an agency that does not?
Yeah, that's a great question, June. I guess I'd wonder what it means if an agency does not have the qualifications. I assume that can mean, an agency perhaps that isn't quite as established. It doesn't have maybe all of the capacity. I mean, it is common for agencies who specialize in a particular area and maybe don't have all the capacity to go after this funding themselves. But if you provide a certain type of service that you think would be beneficial for folks who are running a program, that yeah, you can be a subcontract to another organization's project. Absolutely, if that answers your question. But if you have like really specific questions about what that could look like or what your agency is interested in doing, you can definitely reach out to Homebase and we can have that conversation. Thanks, Joe. All right. Well, again, we'll send the chat doc out, we'll send this Mentimeter out, and even as I pivot to the slide deck, I'm going to keep Mentimeter open. So if you change your mind, you can put your contact information in there. But again, the takeaway here is yes, please partner. If that's something your agency feels led to do, if you feel like you can create bigger impact, leverage resources, maybe you want to expand your capacity to provide critical services to unhoused folks, then that can be a good way to approach this particular funding source. All right. Now I'm going to cover some very technical things. So for folks who are just on the call, maybe getting a refresher, maybe this is not news to you. But if you're a new project and this information is unfamiliar, I know it's going to be a bit tedious, but I encourage you to at least try to, take away some larger points from this. So I'm going to cover each of these in some detail, some more than others. So there are particular grant requirements. There's a lot of them actually. And these are just some of them, important ones that we wanted to raise for your consideration if you are going to apply for this funding. One is coordinated entry. And I'm going to talk about that. I have a whole slide about coordinated entry. I know folks, I think some are here from the coordinated entry team, perhaps even from H3. But coordinated entry is a thing that you're going to have to participate in. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then another thing that you're going to have to be aware of is housing first. It's an approach to this work, and your project is definitely going to have to adopt it as a key principle. And so I have a slide specific to housing first as well. But I'll highlight some things here that I don't have dedicated slides to. So HMIS and data quality standards. HMIS stands for Homeless Management Information System. HUD requires COCs, including Contra Costa, to implement HMIS, basically to implement their own system of how to manage information about programs and clients served. And COC funded agencies, so that is, if you are going to have this funding or you currently have this funding, you're required to utilize the local HMIS system to keep client and program data. HUD has, in addition to that, has also developed data quality standards to allow for standardized data collection on individuals and families experiencing homelessness across communities and systems. So there are standards that you have to follow. And so, this is something you're not familiar with. You should look into it at least a little bit before applying for it. This funding. You're going to have to participate in the local HMIS system. You're going to have to adhere to some data quality standards. In addition to the HMIS standards at a federal level with HUD, Contra Costa actually has its own HMIS system policies and procedures. And they also have their own data quality monitoring plan. So those are other documents that you want to be aware of. Thank you, Jamie. I was just about to pop it in, but you're ahead of me. Go for it. In addition, another thing I just want to spend a little time on is record keeping and documentation, recipients and even sub-recipients. Again, talking about partnerships. They must maintain complete up-to-date written records and procedures for each of the CoC funded projects. If you have multiple projects, for each of the projects funded under CoC NOFO, you're going to have to keep records and have procedures. And there's a document that HUD has, actually probably several documents, but here's one of them that has HUD's record keeping requirements. Apologies for all the links they're throwing in the chat, but we will follow up with all these resources for you. So don't worry if you weren't able to jot all these down, but just know that there are resources that exist. So yes, there is a lot of detail. There's a lot to know if you don't know it already, but there are resources that have been established. There's support within the CoC itself to use HMIS. If you do receive CoC NOFO funding, there's whole training to be a user in HMIS. And certainly Homebase is also able to answer any questions during the application process about these things. The other thing that I want to mention here is match. Again, I think I mentioned it earlier, but there is a 25% match requirement for the grant. So it means you have to have other sources of support, cash or in-kind resources that will satisfy this 25% match. You need to have a letter to document that commitment. So that's another requirement if you're going to apply for this funding. I think I've been talking a lot. I'm going to take a breath as we go to the next slide. All right, just a time check. Looks like I think we're in good shape. So I talked about, or I mentioned briefly, coordinated entry. So if you're not familiar with coordinated entry or CES, the coordinated entry system, it's a centralized and coordinated process for intake, assessment, and referrals to ensure equal access to services. HUD requires all CoCs to have a coordinated entry system, and that all CoC funded providers participate in the coordinated entry system. This is where your referrals are going to come to fill the vacancies in your programs should you get funded. And so households are referred based on need and vulnerability. There's a whole set of policies around assessment and prioritization. But know that if you get this funding, you have to participate in coordinated entry. And what that means is for the units that CoC funding is funding, that your only referral source to fill those vacancies are from coordinated entry. If you have other units or other aspects of your project or other projects that are funded by other sources, you don't necessarily have to participate in coordinated entry for those. But for, again, the CoC funded beds and units, you do have to get your referrals from coordinated entry, and you must enroll those eligible households that are referred. So if you weren't aware of this, it's very important to note. You're participating in a coordinated manner across the CoC. Other CoC funded providers are participating in the same way. And it's all about trying to make sure that the most vulnerable, those in most need on the prioritization list get access to these services and units. All right. I feel like I should stop there for a second. And I know like H3 staff are waiting if anybody has questions. I appreciate that. Yeah, any questions about coordinated entry? Okay. Maybe most folks already know about these things, which is great. All right, next item is housing first. This is a very important approach. And I won't read off the slide necessarily, but let me just talk about it in general first. So Housing First is an approach to quickly and successfully connect individuals and families experiencing homelessness to permanent housing without preconditions and barriers to entry. So things like sobriety, being in treatment, or service, or participating in services, those aren't if you're preventing people from being housed because of those preconditions, it's not a Housing First model. So Housing First means that people aren't screened out for the things that are listed there. Having too little or no income, having a criminal record, history of domestic violence. The idea is that we want people to be housed and then help them, according to their need and their preferences, begin to address any issues that they might have and support them. But again, we want them to be housed first, hence Housing First. We also, in this model or approach, you can't terminate people for any one of those things listed there. Loss of income, maybe they haven't made progress on their service plan, maybe they don't want to participate in supportive services. Housing First approach means program participants are not terminated from the program, don't lose their housing because of any of those things listed. And there's other things to be mindful of with Housing First, but these are just kind of the key points we wanted to highlight. Any questions about Housing First? Thanks, Jamie. Quick with the links. There's a link there for Housing First as well. All right, we'll keep moving. This is one of my last slides before we get to the next steps, but there are a number of things here. I'll just put them all on the slide. So, I mean, I don't really intend to go into too much detail here, and most of these things we've touched on already. But overall, I think we just want to take this moment to say that, the CoC program is a great funding source. It can fund important projects that address significant community needs for unhoused folks. It's one of the, if not the largest funding source for housing and homelessness in Contra Costa County. There are other funding sources, but it is, I think, the largest one. And you saw earlier in the slide that Alex showed, I think it was like 13+ million in 2022 that got funded. So yeah, great funding source. And it's a federal funding source that has a lot of requirements. Hopefully that's come through in the presentation, including, and not least of which, an annual competition where if you'd land a grant, you'd have to apply to renew every single year in a competitive process. So overall, I just want to say, if it wasn't clear, it does take considerable capacity, planning, and coordination to land an award with HUD in the CoC NOFO and to successfully implement it moving forward. But that's not meant to scare anyone off, because it can be done, and we certainly want and encourage new applicants to apply. We just want everyone to also have a better and more realistic sense of what you're getting into if you want to apply for CoC NOFO funding. Just know that Homebase is here to provide technical assistance, like we said, to support applicants in this process. Yeah, and you should also know, in addition to CoC NOFO, it's not the only source, right? There are other funding opportunities available to folks in the CoC and also folks who work in housing homelessness in general. Particularly if you haven't had a large federal or state grant before, it can be helpful to build that capacity, experience, and track record with other funding sources first, just something to consider. But again, if you want to go for this funding, totally support you, and we can talk through it. Homebase is available. Some of the stuff on the slide is just some project design considerations, thinking about project type, who you're going to serve. We talked about partnerships earlier. Those are things we can help walk you through. And to that end, I don't know if anyone from H3, Jamie S, wants to say anything about the other funding opportunity bit or anything else related to the CoC NOFO before we go to next steps.
Yeah, I'll just double down on what Mark said. Is if you're looking to break into CoC funding and you haven't, explored this opportunity before, it's a great chance to look at what partnerships in the community can help you get there. It is a lot of work to manage a CoC grant. And again, not to discourage anybody, but we want to set people up for success, and we want people to be able to conduct the services that fits with their programs and their projects in the way that also is mandated by HUD. H3 posts funding opportunities that are more flexible generally, whether that be from state or local resources to our websites. So we can drop the link to that. We also have a funding list, newsletter list that you can sign up for, where you also get the email notification blast about funding opportunities that are open to the community. And we do a funding update at every monthly Council on Homelessness meeting, where we talk about all of the kind of funding opportunities that H3 is supporting, CoC or otherwise. So thank you, Shelby, for posting that there. So if you're available Thursdays, 1 to 3, hybrid format, join us at the Council on Homelessness and hear about those real time.
Thanks, Jamie. Any questions about anything on this slide or anything regarding other funding opportunities, since we're on the topic? Okay, gonna move us on. We are almost done and still have a little bit of time to spare. So what are the next steps? Well, there's a lot of steps that need to happen before we submit to HUD on behalf of the Contra Costa CoC for the CoC NOFO. But the biggest thing is we are waiting for the CoC NOFO to be released. And that can happen any day. It's happened anywhere from June to September in the past, but we generally expect it probably this month or next, but again, no promises. Once it's released, we will work with H3 to create a timeline for the competition, but the activities listed here are generally going to happen in this order. So the first thing that would happen, other than you all receiving emails, and if you registered for this workshop, you're on our contact list, we'll make sure you get that email. That email will announce once we hear that the NOFO, CoC NOFO has been released, we'll announce it to the community. And then within probably 2 to 4 weeks of that, we'll have a mandatory technical assistance workshop. So mandatory for anyone who's applying, renewal or new applicants will need to attend that workshop. And then there's a whole series of steps that happen after that. There was a question earlier about how long you all have to submit an application. Again, we don't know the dates, but generally we try to have both renewal applicants and new applicants. They'll have different timelines because renewal applicants, we might start early. In fact, in the next couple of weeks, if you're a renewal applicant here, we might open up the application process for renewal applicants even before the CoC NOFO drops, because we like to get ahead of that. We already know kind of what HUD's looking for with renewal applicants. But for new project applicants, we tend to give about 3 or 4 weeks for you all from the TA workshop to submit all of your application materials. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what you're working with. And then I'm not going to go over all of those other activities there, but you'll get a detailed timeline at the TA workshop that has all of the important deadlines and dates for the CoC NOFO process. So, and I will say, after this is done, this workshop, at some point, either today or early next week, we will send a follow-up email with the slide deck, all of the links and resources that we've been citing. We'll make sure you all get that. And of course, Homebase is available if you have questions, if you want to run project ideas by us. Again, we're the neutral facilitators of the competition. You can reach us at that email, contracosta@homebaseccc.org. And I'll pause for a little bit. Anybody have any questions? Okay, well, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, no hands raised. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us on a Friday for over an hour. Hopefully this was informative. If you have any questions you want to follow up, you can reach out to us. I think Alex and I could probably hang out for maybe a couple of minutes too, if maybe some people want to sit tight and maybe ask us questions verbally after we release everyone. So again, have a great weekend, everyone. We look forward to working with you during the competition.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys.
Thank you. See you later.
Bye, folks.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye. Thanks, Jamie S.
So Mark, there was an obscure question. This is Jerry Lellenberg.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. I should uncover my thing. On the rapid rehousing and master leasing, which is esoteric, but you said that you can't use rapid rehousing for master leasing. So because then are you paying yourself if you're the master lease? Is that the idea?
Yeah, let me go back to that slide. I don't know if Jamie S, if you have any thoughts on this question. Appreciate the question,
So
Jerry.
this is off the cuff, and I would definitely want us to double check with the HUD language. But from my understanding, you can utilize master leasing with rapid rehousing. You can master lease those units, and then you are the leaseholder with the landlord. Because master leasing, or master leasing assistance generally means you're getting into contract with the landlord. You do not own the assets that you're leasing.
Right. Yeah.
And then you would hold that lease with the landlord. I think the risk of that is that, if there's a vacancy, you're holding that vacancy loss because you are the leaseholder. And eventually the goal of rapid rehousing is to transfer that lease to the tenant, the person in rapid rehousing. So that might be where I could be getting this wrong, is that if there's some challenges in making sure that rapid rehousing participant retains their housing and they are the leaseholder as the subsidy winds down, that could be the sticking point of whether or not it's allowed. So I would want us to go back and double check.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. If the master leasing was permanent housing, then you overcome that, I think. So my background is with Share Sonoma County and shared housing. So that's one of on the community house side of things, that's the business model. I'm not on their board anymore, but I used to be. So that piqued my interest because I know that they do have rapid rehousing here in Sonoma County. So, well, thank you. I really appreciate getting to know you all. And once I finally arrive in Richmond, maybe you'll see more of me. So thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jerry.
Hey folks, I had a question. This is David Schnorr with Mosaic Urban Development. We're working with a client that wants to create permanent supportive housing for people exiting alcohol and drug treatment, and is in recovery from drug and alcohol use, a subpopulation that is permissible.
That's a good question.
I can tell you it would be logistically challenging from a coordinated entry referral standpoint, because that's not something that we kind of screen for. We ask folks if they have substance use disorder, but we don't, get that recovery component during that process. In our kind of housing placement meetings, that could be something we ask if someone's interested in sort of that sober living environment, but it wouldn't be an enforceable kind of sobriety requirement that we could have.
Well, and I don't think the intent is that it's mandatory sobriety, because I think that violates Housing First requirements. But since the provider has specialized skills in running drug treatment facilities, they would like to be able to provide housing to people who are exiting treatment programs, whether theirs or others.
Yeah, I think it would be a challenge on the coordinated entry end of things. I don't know if it's like ineligible or not permissible. I just think it because of the way we prioritize folks, chronically homeless, length of time, their BI score, that sort of thing. It wouldn't necessarily, if people are exiting a facility, they're not necessarily going to float to the top of that list.
Okay. I mean, I think that the logistics is something we can continue to discuss, but the eligibility certainly is something I'd love to get, you know, a firm answer on. Is there someone I should follow up with on that who can help me find out the correct answer?
Yeah, absolutely. We could follow up with you, David.
Terrific. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. All right. June, did you have a question?
Yes, actually.
Yeah.
Hi. So I don't live in Contra Costa County, so I'm just asking generally about this funding. So I'm interested in building tiny homes in my community and using them as transitional housing into permanent housing. And I'm wondering, would this money, if I could apply for this money to purchase land, build the tiny homes, and pay for part of the services, part to all of the services. It's a big ask, right?
Generally speaking, the annual CoC funds can't be used for acquisition or capital development.
Okay.
So it would be unlikely that the community you're in, your CoC would you know, prioritize that kind of project. But HUD does have throughout the year kind of opportunities for those type of projects. The state also has Project Home Key, which is intended for purchase, acquisition, development of interim or permanent housing. And as Homebase kind of talked about earlier in the presentation, HUD isn't super interested in transitional housing as a standalone. So it would have to be paired with that permanent housing pathway that you're talking about. So it would, you know, if it down the road and you've got these developed, it would take some crafting of the application to make sure it's really targeted to what HUD wants to fund.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course.
And I appreciate all you guys for this training, this group meeting, whatever you want to call it, workshop. Because my boss is just like, say, okay, now you've had enough little taste of this, now go do it. So, oh, and Alex, it's nice to meet you. How are you?
I was gonna say, nice to see you.
Yeah, you too.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. Thanks for being here with us today.
Hey, and thanks for being so helpful with all the things that you've helped me with. I appreciate it very much.
No worries.
All
no
right.
worries.
Yeah,
June,
take
if you don't
care.
mind me asking, what community are you in?
Solano County.
Oh, very cool, very cool.
Yeah, Solano County. We need services out here. We, you know, and the people here are like 10 years behind. Their thinking is like 10 years behind everybody else's thinking. You know what I mean? So it's kind of tough out here to get anything going. This, just for instance, I'll tell you, I was at a meeting and it was a homelessness meeting. And I was saying, you know, we got to get on top of this. I said, because, you know, that homeless situation is moving this way. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but it's moving this way. And if you don't know how bad it could get, go to Oakland and take a look around. You can see just how bad it can really get, you know? And this lady told me all of our homeless people are from Solano County. I didn't even know how to respond to that. All of our homeless people are from Solano County. All homeless people are transitional. They move from, you know, they're transient. They move wherever they can get services and wherever they feel comfortable.
Well,
So,
actually,
oh, you're gonna tell me something different?
That's true.
Yes.
But for the most part, folks become homeless where they live.
Yes, I agree with that.
A big chunk of folks have 1, 5, 10 years of history of whatever community they end up losing their housing in. We've got a lot of data on our website, and I don't know if Solano has anything comparable that kind of talks about where folks are coming from. But you're right, when housing affordability in the region becomes an issue, homelessness rises across.
Yeah. I used to work in homeless services. I would see people that I work with in Berkeley, right out here on the streets in Fairfield. So there you go. Yeah. All right, ladies and gents, take care, you guys.
Thanks, June. Good to have you.
Bye-bye. You too.
Thanks, Jamie S. Appreciate you.
Oh, where'd I go?
All right,
Mark,
John.
Alex, anything from the beginning that I missed that you want me to follow up on?
No, I don't think so.
Cool.
No.
We'll follow up with, I forget, I'm sure, Alex, you wrote it down, the person's name who asked the question about.
David.
Yeah, David.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll follow up with David.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, guys. Have a great weekend.
You too.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.